And John Lyons obviously still staying with us. Let me start with the panel and then come back to you, John. One of the things in the article that I found most interesting at the very end of John Lyons' piece in the Inquirer on the weekend was not just that Peter Credlin sat down for a few hours with him, but these cartoons that are hanging up in the office. Now, we can all have a bit of a joke. Apparently, Tony Abbott gave his Chief of Staff one of those cartoons, the one where she looks like Xena, the warrior princess, and he's cowering behind her. Fine. Shouldn't they be hung up at home, Nick Cater, rather than sitting in the office?
Well, I think you're being a bit precious about that, Peter. I mean, I've got a Bill Leak cartoon hanging in my office. It's not of me,
But I bet you didn't have a Bill Leak cartoon of Chris Mitchell sitting on your shoulders as you prop him up as editor-in-chief of The Australian sitting in your office.
I don't know that Bill's ever done one of those. I might suggest it to him. No, look, I mean, I think this is the great tradition of Australian humour and satire and the ability of people to laugh at themselves, and I think it's wonderful. I think if you haven't got a Bill Leak cartoon in your office, there's something missing.
But hang on, Rowan Dean, Peter Credlin hasn't got an article in her office of her laughing at herself. I've got plenty of Eric Lebecki columns from illustrations from my columns where she could pop them up if she wants to laugh at herself. The one that I am most interested in is there's one of her sitting on, I'm looking at it now, sitting on the Prime Minister. He's bound and gagged with her hand over his mouth with a reporter trying to talk to him, and it says misogynist down, and she says, look, he's the strong silent type. Can't you see that? What kind of vibe does that send about a Prime Minister sitting in the office? Put it up in your study. Ask for it from the paper. I've got no problem with that.
You probably would, Peter, but self-deprecation and the ability to laugh at oneself is one of the great...
Not
exactly, sure. But if Tony Abbott gave it to her, it was his way of self-deprecation. I'm glad that you said that it was one of the most interesting things about the article, because, no offence, John, I had to read that article twice to try and find out what the point was, what was the story. Maybe it was the cartoons, because I really couldn't see why there was a story about the Prime Minister doing his job. His job being, like the CEO of any corporation, to find out his capabilities, his limitations, what he can do in a given set of circumstances or not. I would also be horrified if the Prime Minister of Australia only felt he could take military action if the Americans told him to. I'm aghast at that. We are a sovereign nation, and if our Prime Minister feels that circumstances may be such and in some given future set of circumstances that he wants to take military action, thank goodness he did it.
Let me give John Lyons a chance to respond, but just before you do, what about the fact, though, you're saying you'd be aghast if the Prime Minister wasn't doing those sort of things?
Absolutely.
Well, he denied today in Parliament that he is.
Strange. Well, he's
so
denied the specific...
that he's not?
Yeah, I'm aghast that he's denying it, because, quite frankly, I would be horrified if the Prime Minister of this country did not find out precisely what military capabilities we had. I have no idea. You'd have to ask him that.
John Lyons.
Well, there were several points to the story, one of which was to explain to people that there's essentially a duumvirate now running Australia. I've written about Prime Minister's offices as far back as Bob Hawke.
Sure, but that was the other story. That was a different story.
You were all in favour of that. I remember how much you loved his report on Kevin Rudd.
Yes, exactly. It was a great one, yes.
So my view is I don't care which side of politics they're on. You go down to Canberra and you look at how a Prime Minister's office functions. I think that this Prime Minister is being brought down partly because of the dysfunction of his office.
Sure, but that was the other story. I'm talking about the
Which one are you
story.
about?
You had two different stories. One which was all about the fact that we now have a co-Prime Minister, you called her, in Peter Credlin, and that this was a hugely dysfunctional government and all the rest. You may be right and all that, but my point is the story about him asking the capabilities of the military, I had to read it twice to find out what the point was. And it seemed to me that the point was that you were trying to make was that this was extraordinary that a Prime Minister would ask or even suggest that Australia might at some point have to go it alone and take on IS by
I think that's extraordinary, the idea that Australia would on its own go into Iraq.
So what happens if we have a pilot down? What happens if we have a pilot down? Do we sit on our hands?
No, we have an SAS team of 200 or so based in the United Arab Emirates.
What if, as was reported today, Al-Shabaab or IS call for a bombing which occurs in Westfield Centre in Sydney or Melbourne, 2,000 people are killed, and the order comes from IS? Sorry, would you?
Let me bring Nick
My
Cater in.
point is,
let me bring
you
Nick
must
Cater in.
know all options that are on the table.
I'm finding this whole conversation bizarre. I mean, there was no formal approach, right, John? No formal approach.
Informal.
The Secretary of the Department of Defence describes it as piffle, which may be a little bit harsh on your story, John. I'm not saying that. So, and your story, as you know, the editor pointed out this morning, did not say there'd been a formal approach. Look, I don't know that I'd go along with Rowan and say I'd like to see our troops unilaterally thrown into combat in Iraq. That's rather.
I'm not saying I'd like to. I'm saying the Prime Minister should know if he can.
I'd be horrified if around a table, assuming this is what's happened, I've no clue that these ideas weren't thrown around and the Prime Minister didn't have his 6 bobs worth. So I really don't see that there's any problem in this whatsoever. You know,
you don't dispute it. You just don't see that there's anything bad in it for the Prime Minister.
Well, look, it's clear that he made no formal approach of that sort. I mean, I don't think anybody's disputing.
It didn't go before the National Security Committee or anything. It was not a formal proposal.
So what is the story? So what is the story? That's what I keep asking. What was the story?
I think the story is the judgment of the Prime Minister.
The judgment of the Prime Minister. So
John,
that's the story. Nothing to do with the government being run by a woman. The judgment of the Prime Minister.
You can't say that because, you know, let's assume he made the suggestion. We don't know that he did. He plainly then listened to advice that said, look, we don't think that's a good idea, Prime Minister, and he didn't do it. So it's very strange to me that I don't see quite how you can argue the judgment of a Prime Minister.
3 months before, the army had to talk, the military had to talk him out of the idea of sending 1,000 Australian troops into the Ukraine.
Well, once again,
same thing. He didn't do it.
I'm not sure what the import of that is.
Let's move on. Let's move on. Only because we're going to run out of time. I suspect viewers are enjoying this. But the big news of the day.
And that's why it's crucial that we have the legislative tools that really say we are prepared to tackle Islamism at its root, and that's what today was all about.
Radical Islamism.
Yeah. Islamism is radical. Islamism, not the Islamic religion. Islamism is by definition radical.
All right. Well, before we run out of time.